The Sunday morning service at Elevation Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, was in full swing when the side door quietly opened. Pastor Furtick was delivering his sermon about finding purpose when a young boy with bright eyes and a determined expression walked in with a tall, bearded man. The congregation hardly noticed at first, but Pastor Furtick caught sight of them from the stage. The child, maybe 8 years old, wore a simple red sweater and jeans, walking with the confidence of someone much older. The man beside him moved with quiet grace, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. And so we must remember that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things, Pastor Furtick continued, his eyes drawn to the pair making their way down the center aisle. The boy seemed completely at ease despite the hundreds of people around him, occasionally pointing out details of the church to his companion. Several congregation members turned to look as they passed, whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd. The man kept his head down, clearly trying to avoid recognition, but something about his gentle demeanor with the child caught people's attention. A woman seated near the front row noticed them and smiled warmly. "Welcome to Elevation," she whispered as they approached. The boy looked up at her with serious eyes that seemed far older than his years. "Thank you, ma'am. My Uncle Jonathan said this was a special place where people talk about important things." His voice carried clearly in the hushed sanctuary, and more heads began to turn. The man he called Uncle Jonathan placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder, his expression both proud and slightly apprehensive. Pastor Furtick paused mid-sentence, something about the scene capturing his full attention. The boy stood straighter when he realized the pastor was looking at him, showing no intimidation despite the massive church or the famous preacher on stage. "What's your name, young man?" Pastor Furtick asked gently into the microphone. The child stepped forward without hesitation. "My name is Matthew, sir. This is my Uncle Jonathan. We came because I have questions about God." The simplicity and directness of his statement sent a wave of surprised murmurs through the congregation. As the service coordinator hurried down the aisle with a portable microphone, several people in the crowd began to recognize the bearded man. He was Jonathan Roumie, the actor who portrayed Jesus in the hit series, The Chosen. But what was he doing here, with this remarkable child? How had an 8-year-old convinced one of the most recognizable faces in Christian entertainment to bring him to church? Pastor Furtick maintained his composure, though his eyes showed genuine curiosity about what would unfold next. "Well, Matthew, it's wonderful to have you and your Uncle Jonathan visit us today," Pastor Furtick said warmly. "What kind of questions do you have?" Matthew took the microphone without any stage fright, holding it carefully as he'd seen adults do. "Uncle Jonathan plays Jesus in movies, but I want to know what the real Jesus was like. Did he ask questions too when he was my age?" The congregation fell completely silent, the profound innocence of the question touching something deep in their hearts. Jonathan Roumie shifted uncomfortably, clearly not wanting to draw attention to himself, but his love for his nephew was evident in his supportive presence. The service coordinator looked questioningly at Pastor Furtick, who nodded, intrigued by where this unexpected moment might lead. Matthew continued, his voice clear and confident. "My mom says Uncle Jonathan studies Jesus every day for his job, but I think there's more to learn than just what's in movies." The wisdom behind such simple words left many in the congregation visibly moved. Pastor Furtick made a quick decision that would change the trajectory of the service entirely. "Matthew, would you like to come up here and talk with me about your questions? I think everyone here might learn something important from what you want to know." The boy nodded eagerly, already heading toward the stage steps. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then followed, his humility evident as he tried to stay in the background while supporting his nephew. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pastor Furtick addressed the crowd as Matthew climbed the steps. "I believe God often speaks through the most unexpected messengers. Today, let's listen to what Matthew has to ask us, and perhaps we'll all discover something important together." The congregation watched in amazement as Pastor Furtick pulled up a chair for the young boy, while Jonathan stood quietly to the side, his eyes filled with pride and protective concern. The stage setup was intimate despite the massive sanctuary, with Matthew's small frame dwarfed by the professional lighting and large screens. But his presence seemed to fill the space with an energy that technology couldn't create. Pastor Furtick sat down next to him, adjusting his microphone to match the child's height. "So, Matthew," he began gently, "you asked if Jesus asked questions when he was your age. That's a wonderful question to start with." Matthew's legs swung freely from the chair as he considered the pastor's response. "Uncle Jonathan says that Jesus was perfect, but I don't understand how someone can be perfect and still need to learn things. Don't you have to ask questions to learn?" The theological depth of his inquiry caught Pastor Furtick off guard, and he glanced briefly at Jonathan, who offered an encouraging nod. "What made you think about that, Matthew?" "Well," Matthew began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "when I watch Uncle Jonathan prepare for his scenes, he asks lots of questions about how Jesus would have felt, or what he would have done. But if Jesus already knew everything, why would he need to feel confused or sad or happy?" The congregation remained completely silent, hanging on every word from this remarkable child, who was articulating questions many adults had never dared to voice. Pastor Furtick smiled, recognizing the genuine spiritual curiosity in Matthew's questions. "You know what, Matthew? Jesus was both fully God and fully human. As a human child, he did grow and learn just like you do. The Bible tells us he grew in wisdom and stature." Matthew's eyes lit up with understanding. "So he did ask questions. That makes me feel better about having so many questions myself." "Questions are how we grow closer to God," Pastor Furtick explained, his pastoral heart fully engaged with this unexpected teaching moment. "What other questions do you have?" Matthew looked out at the congregation, then back at the pastor. "Uncle Jonathan says people sometimes get angry when you ask questions about God. Why do grown-ups get scared of questions if God likes them?" The directness of Matthew's observation sent ripples of recognition through the audience. Many had experienced exactly what he described. The discomfort or defensiveness that sometimes arose when faith was examined too closely. Pastor Furtick took a moment to consider his response, aware that hundreds of people were listening intently to how he would address this child's profound insight about adult behavior. "You know what, Matthew? Sometimes grown-ups forget that faith is supposed to be a journey, not a destination. We get so focused on having all the answers that we forget the joy of discovering new things about God." Pastor Furtick's voice carried genuine emotion as he continued. "Your questions show that you're thinking deeply about important things, and that's exactly what God wants from all of us." Jonathan watched from the side of the stage, his expression reflecting amazement at his nephew's theological curiosity. As an actor who had spent years studying the character of Jesus, he understood the complexity of the questions Matthew was raising. The fact that an 8-year-old was grappling with these concepts so naturally spoke to something extraordinary about the child's spiritual awareness and intellectual capacity. Matthew shifted in his chair, another question clearly forming in his mind. "Pastor Stephen, can I ask you something else?" When the pastor nodded encouragingly, Matthew continued, "Uncle Jonathan shows me how he prays before every scene to try to honor the real Jesus. But how do we know if we're doing it right when we can't see Jesus to ask him directly?" The question hung in the air like a prayer itself, touching the heart of faith's fundamental challenge. Pastor Furtick felt the weight of hundreds of people waiting for his response, knowing that his answer would speak not just to a child, but to anyone who had ever struggled with the invisibility of the divine. "Matthew, that's one of the most important questions anyone can ask about faith. When we can't see Jesus with our eyes," Pastor Furtick explained, "we learn to see him with our hearts. Your Uncle Jonathan probably feels Jesus' presence when he's playing that role because he's opening his heart to let Jesus in." Matthew nodded thoughtfully. "Like when I feel close to my mom even when she's at work. I can't see her, but I know she loves me." "Exactly like that," Pastor Furtick confirmed, his voice filled with warmth. "Love is something we feel, not something we see. Faith works the same way." The congregation murmured in agreement, many visibly moved by the simple yet profound comparison. Several people were already recording this unexpected interaction on their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something truly special. Matthew looked out at the audience, his confidence growing with each exchange. "Can I ask them something too?" he requested, gesturing toward the congregation. Pastor Furtick glanced at Jonathan, who nodded his approval, then addressed the crowd. "I think Matthew has a question for all of us. Let's listen carefully." Standing up in his chair to see everyone better, Matthew spoke directly to the congregation. "My uncle Jonathan pretends to be Jesus on TV, but he says the real Jesus lives in people's hearts. If that's true, why do some people who say they love Jesus treat other people badly?" The innocent question cut straight to one of Christianity's most persistent challenges, and the silence that followed was profound. Pastor Furtick felt the weight of the moment, recognizing that Matthew had just voiced a concern that kept many people away from faith communities. "Matthew, that's a question that shows you have a very loving heart. What do you think the answer might be?" Rather than immediately providing an answer, he invited the child to explore his own understanding first. Matthew scrunched up his face in concentration, the kind of expression children make when they're working through something really important. "I think maybe some people forget that Jesus wants us to be kind to everyone, not just people who think the same things we do. Uncle Jonathan always says Jesus spent time with people others didn't like." "You're absolutely right," Pastor Furtick affirmed, his admiration for the child's wisdom evident. "Sometimes people get so focused on being right that they forget about being loving. Jesus always chose love first." The congregation was visibly moved by this exchange, many nodding in recognition of times they had witnessed or experienced the very contradiction Matthew had identified. Jonathan stepped slightly closer to the conversation, his protective instincts balanced with his obvious pride in his nephew's spiritual insights. As someone who had dedicated years to understanding Jesus' character for his portrayal, he was witnessing Matthew grasp concepts that many adults struggled with. The child's natural empathy and clarity of thought were remarkable even to someone who spent his days surrounded by theological scholars and spiritual advisors. "Uncle Jonathan," Matthew called out, "do you want to answer a question too?" Jonathan looked surprised, clearly preferring to stay in the background, but his love for his nephew overcame his reluctance. "What would you like to know, buddy?" he asked, stepping closer to the microphone area. "When you're playing Jesus, do you ever feel like you're really talking to God?" Matthew's question was personal and intimate, revealing the deep connection he felt with his uncle's work. The congregation leaned forward, curious to hear how the famous actor would respond to such a direct question about the spiritual dimension of his craft. Jonathan took a moment to compose his thoughts, clearly wanting to give Matthew an honest and meaningful answer. "You know, Matthew, there are moments when the line between performing and praying gets very blurry. Sometimes I feel like God is using me to share Jesus' love with people, and that's both wonderful and a little scary." "Scary?" Matthew asked, tilting his head with curiosity. Why would talking to God be scary? His innocent question revealed a child's natural comfort with the divine, uncomplicated by the adult anxieties that often make prayer feel intimidating or formal. Because when you really open your heart to God, He might ask you to do things that are hard or different from what you planned, Jonathan explained gently. "Playing Jesus has changed how I see everything, how I treat people, how I think about my purpose, even how I talk to you. God has a way of making us better people, but that means we have to be willing to change." Matthew nodded seriously, processing this concept with the gravity of someone much older. "Is that why you brought me here today? Because God is changing you?" The question was so direct and insightful that Jonathan's eyes filled with emotion. The congregation watched this tender moment between uncle and nephew unfold, many feeling privileged to witness such authentic spiritual conversation. "Partly yes," Jonathan admitted, his voice thick with feeling. "You asked so many beautiful questions about faith that I realized I needed to bring you somewhere where smarter people than me could help answer them. Pastor Stephen and this community know things about God that I'm still learning." Pastor Furtick was clearly moved by the exchange between uncle and nephew. Recognizing the humility it took for someone of Jonathan's spiritual prominence to admit he was still learning, Jonathan, your willingness to keep asking questions even while portraying Jesus is exactly the kind of faith Matthew is talking about. One that grows through curiosity, rather than claiming to have all the answers. But I do have all the answers, Matthew announced with the confident matter-of-factness that only children possess. The congregation chuckled softly, wondering where this declaration would lead. I know that God loves everyone. Jesus wants us to be kind. And asking questions is good. That's pretty much everything important, right? The simplicity of Matthew's complete theology brought smiles throughout the sanctuary. But Pastor Furtick recognized profound truth in the child's distillation of faith to its essential elements. Matthew, I think you've just preached one of the best sermons I've ever heard. Love God, love people, stay curious. That might be all we really need to know. See? Matthew said triumphantly, looking between his uncle and the pastor. Grown-ups make everything too complicated. Uncle Jonathan reads these really thick books about Jesus, but Jesus probably just wanted people to be nice to each other and remember that God is real. His theological confidence was both amusing and startling in its clarity. The congregation was fully engaged now, many feeling convicted by an 8-year-old's ability to cut through religious complexity to find the heart of faith. Pastor Furtick sensed this was becoming more than just an unexpected interruption. It was turning into a transformational moment for everyone present. Jonathan knelt down to Matthew's level, speaking into the microphone, but addressing his nephew directly. You know what, buddy? I think you've taught me something really important today. Sometimes I get so caught up in trying to be perfect in my portrayal that I forget Jesus' message was actually really simple. Love people and trust God. Exactly, Matthew exclaimed, jumping up from his chair with excitement. And you don't have to be perfect to do that. Jesus loved people who made mistakes all the time. His childlike enthusiasm was infectious, and several people in the congregation began to smile and nod, feeling a weight of religious perfectionism lifting from their shoulders. Pastor Furtick stood up, sensing this was a pivotal moment in the service. Friends, I think we're witnessing something extraordinary here today. Matthew has reminded us that faith doesn't have to be complicated or intimidating. It can be as simple as love, kindness, and curiosity. He addressed the cameras in the congregation simultaneously. If you're watching this moment and feeling inspired by Matthew's simple faith, if you believe that sometimes the most profound truths come from the most innocent hearts, go ahead and like this video and comment the word simple below. Let's see how many of us are ready to embrace the uncomplicated love that Matthew is showing us today. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Throughout the sanctuary, people began reaching for their phones, many wiping away tears as they processed the impact of what they had just witnessed. Matthew watched with curiosity as hundreds of people suddenly became very busy with their devices, not understanding the digital ripple effect he had just created. Why is everyone taking pictures? Matthew asked innocently. Are we famous now? This question brought laughter throughout the church, lightening the emotional intensity of the moment while maintaining its spiritual significance. Jonathan chuckled and ruffled his nephew's hair affectionately. Not famous, buddy, Jonathan explained. But I think people want to remember what you've shared today because it's really special. He looked out at the congregation, then back at Matthew. You've helped a lot of people understand something important about God today. Pastor Furtick decided to extend the service, recognizing that something unprecedented was happening. Matthew, would you be willing to take questions from some of the people here today? I have a feeling they might have learned as much from you as you've learned from us. Matthew looked excited by the prospect, bouncing slightly on his toes. Can I really? He asked, looking between his uncle and the pastor for permission. When both nodded encouragingly, Matthew turned to the congregation with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and valued. Okay, but I might not know all the answers. Sometimes I don't know is an okay answer too, right? A woman in the third row raised her hand tentatively. When Pastor Furtick nodded to her, she stood up nervously. Matthew, I've been angry at God for a long time because some bad things happened to my family. How do I stop being angry? Her voice shook with emotion, revealing years of buried pain and spiritual struggle. Matthew considered her question with the seriousness it deserved, his young face scrunched in concentration. My mom says it's okay to be angry sometimes, even at people we love. Maybe God understands that you're angry because you're hurt, not because you don't love him. The woman's eyes filled with tears at the gentle wisdom in his response. Uncle Jonathan, Matthew continued, when you play Jesus, does he ever seem sad about bad things? Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. Yes, buddy. Jesus cried when his friend died, and he got angry when people were being hurt by others who were supposed to protect them. I think Jesus understands anger when it comes from love. The woman sat down, clearly comforted by both Matthew's innocent wisdom and Jonathan's professional insight into Jesus' emotional life. Pastor Furtick watched the interaction with amazement, recognizing that ministry was happening in ways he had never experienced before. A man near the back raised his hand next. Matthew, the man called out, I work in science, and sometimes people tell me I can't believe in both science and God. What do you think about that? His question revealed a struggle many modern believers faced, caught between their intellectual pursuits and their faith communities. Matthew's eyes lit up with interest. That's silly. God made everything, right? So when you study science, you're just learning about the things God made. His matter-of-fact response drew appreciative murmurs from throughout the congregation. Uncle Jonathan, don't the people who make your show have to know science stuff too? Absolutely, Jonathan confirmed. We work with historians, archaeologists, linguists, and all kinds of scientists to make sure we're showing Jesus' world accurately. Learning about how things work just makes God seem more amazing, not less. The scientist in the back nodded gratefully, visibly relieved to hear his dual interests validated rather than criticized. An elderly woman in the front row spoke up without waiting to be called on. Young man, I've been going to church for 70 years, and I sometimes feel like I don't know God as well as I should. Do you think that's normal? Her vulnerability in admitting this uncertainty touched the hearts of many who had similar feelings. Matthew walked to the edge of the stage to be closer to her, his natural empathy drawing him toward anyone who seemed sad or worried. I think knowing God is like knowing my uncle. Every day I learn something new about him, but that doesn't mean I didn't know him yesterday. Maybe God is so big that we can always find new things to love about him. The elderly woman smiled through her tears, reaching up to gently pat Matthew's hand as he leaned down from the stage. You're quite right, dear. Thank you for reminding me that learning is a lifelong adventure. The tender interaction between the 8-year-old and the elderly woman embodied the intergenerational wisdom that true faith communities could foster. Pastor Furtick watched these organic connections forming throughout his sanctuary, realizing that Matthew had inadvertently created something far more powerful than any planned program could achieve. The child's natural ability to see through pretense and speak directly to people's hearts was facilitating healing conversations that might otherwise take months of counseling to reach. A teenage girl near the side raised her hand shyly. Matthew, my friends at school make fun of me for believing in God. How do you handle it when people don't understand what you believe? Her question revealed the social pressure many young believers faced in increasingly secular environments. Matthew thought about this seriously, clearly understanding the difficulty of being different from your peers. Well, I guess if your friends make fun of you for being kind and loving people, maybe they're not very good friends. Uncle Jonathan says the most important thing is to be nice to everyone, even people who aren't nice to you. But it's hard sometimes, he continued with honest vulnerability. When people laugh at things that are important to you, it hurts. But maybe if you keep being kind, they'll start wondering why you're different in a good way. His authentic acknowledgement of the challenge, while maintaining his optimistic perspective, resonated strongly with the teenager and many others facing similar struggles. Jonathan felt a surge of pride watching his nephew navigate these complex emotional and spiritual territories with such grace. As someone in the public eye who faced criticism for his faith-based work, he recognized Matthew's wisdom about responding to mockery with persistent kindness. The child was demonstrating principles that many adults struggled to implement. A man in his 30s stood up near the middle section. Matthew, I made some really bad mistakes in my past, and I don't feel worthy of God's love. How do I know if God can forgive someone like me? The vulnerability in his question was palpable, representing the shame many carried about their past actions. Matthew's expression grew very serious as he considered this question. Uncle Jonathan, when you play Jesus, does he ever turn people away who are sorry for doing bad things? Jonathan shook his head emphatically. Never, buddy. Jesus always welcomes people who want to do better. Then I think God is probably really good at forgiving, Matthew concluded with simple logic. My mom forgives me even when I do really naughty things, and she says God loves me even more than she does. So if God is better at loving than moms are, he must be really, really good at forgiving too. The man's face crumpled with emotion, years of self-condemnation beginning to crack under the assault of childlike faith. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, with Matthew addressing everything from doubt and fear to purpose and meaning, with a combination of innocence and insight that left the congregation alternately laughing and crying. Jonathan remained supportive but largely stepped back, recognizing that his nephew was having conversations that transcended anything he could facilitate as a professional actor or adult. During a brief lull in questions, Pastor Furtick addressed the congregation directly. I have to tell you all, in 25 years of ministry, I have never experienced anything like what's happening here today. Matthew has shown us what Jesus meant when he said, "We must become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven." It's not about being naive or simplistic, Pastor Furtick continued. It's about approaching God with the openness, honesty, and trust that Matthew has demonstrated. No pretense, no performance, just authentic relationship. The pastor's voice carried deep emotion as he recognized the transformation happening not just in individual hearts, but in the entire atmosphere of the service. Matthew looked around the sanctuary, seeming to notice for the first time how many people were emotional. Why is everyone crying? He asked with genuine concern. Did I say something wrong? His worry about potentially hurting people's feelings revealed the compassionate heart that had made his ministry so effective. No, buddy, Jonathan assured him quickly. These are happy tears. Sometimes when people feel really loved and understood, they cry because it feels so good. Matthew nodded as if this made perfect sense, though he clearly found adult emotional expressions somewhat puzzling. A mother with 2 small children spoke up from the back. Matthew? My kids asked me questions about God that I don't know how to answer. What should I tell them? Her question reflected the anxiety many parents felt about providing adequate spiritual guidance when their own understanding felt incomplete. Just tell them what you do know and say you'll try to find out the rest together, Matthew suggested with the practical wisdom of someone who had clearly experienced this kind of honesty from the adults in his life. Uncle Jonathan tells me, I don't know all the time, but then we look things up or ask people who might know better. That takes away the pressure to be perfect, he continued, unknowingly articulating a principle that could revolutionize family spiritual conversations. Kids just want to know you care about the same things they care about. Right, Uncle Jonathan? Jonathan nodded enthusiastically, struck by his nephew's intuitive understanding of authentic relationship dynamics. Pastor Furtick realized they had been in this extended service for over 2 hours, but no one seemed eager to leave. The organic community that had formed around Matthew's questions was creating connections that people were reluctant to abandon. Before we conclude, he announced, I want to ask Matthew one final question. Matthew, Pastor Furtick said, kneeling down to the child's level, what do you hope people remember from today? It was a question that would capture the essence of what had become an extraordinary morning of spiritual discovery and community building. Matthew thought carefully, his young face serious with the weight of the question. I hope they remember that God likes questions, that being nice is more important than being right, and that you don't have to understand everything to love God and love people. His summary was both comprehensive and beautifully simple. And I hope they remember that Uncle Jonathan is really good at being Jesus in movies. But the real Jesus lives in all of us when we're kind to each other, he added with obvious affection for his uncle. Jonathan's eyes filled with tears at this endorsement from the person whose opinion mattered most to him. The congregation erupted in sustained applause, not the polite acknowledgement typical of church services, but the genuine appreciation of people who had witnessed something truly transformational. Matthew looked surprised by the response, waving shyly as if he were on stage for a school play, rather than having just facilitated profound spiritual conversations for hundreds of people. As the formal service concluded, something remarkable happened. Instead of the usual quick exodus, people began gravitating toward each other, continuing conversations that had been sparked by Matthew's questions. The scientist approached the woman struggling with anger, offering to discuss how his research had actually strengthened his faith rather than challenging it. The teenager who faced mockery at school found herself surrounded by adults sharing their own stories of standing up for their beliefs in difficult circumstances. The man seeking forgiveness was embraced by others who had experienced similar guilt and grace. What had begun as a church service had evolved into an organic support network facilitated by an 8-year-old's spiritual honesty. Jonathan watched these interactions with amazement, recognizing that his nephew had accomplished something he strived for in his professional work, making spiritual truth accessible and compelling to people from all walks of life. The child's natural ability to connect with others transcended any acting technique or theological training. Pastor Furtick approached Jonathan and Matthew as the crowd began to thin. "I have to ask, this kind of spiritual insight isn't typical for an 8-year-old. What's his background?" Jonathan smiled, clearly proud but also somewhat mystified by his nephew's capabilities. "Honestly, he's always been like this," Jonathan explained. "He asks questions that make me think harder about my faith than any theology book I've read. His mom, my sister, says he's been talking about God since he could form sentences, but not in a preachy way. He just seems naturally curious about spiritual things." "Today was his idea," Jonathan continued. "He said he wanted to see what a real church was like, since he'd only seen me pretend to be Jesus. I thought maybe a large, welcoming congregation like yours would be a good place for him to explore his questions safely." Pastor Furtick shook his head in wonder. "Jonathan, I think your nephew may have just revolutionized how we think about children's ministry. Most programs focus on giving kids answers, but Matthew has shown us the power of letting them ask questions and explore their own understanding." Matthew tugged on his uncle's sleeve, clearly ready to leave but polite about waiting for the adult conversation to conclude. "Uncle Jonathan, can we come back next week? I want to know what happens when people think about these questions for a while." His expectation that the conversations would continue revealed his understanding that spiritual growth was an ongoing process rather than a single event. "If Pastor Stephen doesn't mind having us," Jonathan replied, looking questioningly at the pastor. "Mind? I'm going to restructure our entire approach to spiritual formation based on what happened here today." Pastor Furtick responded enthusiastically. "Matthew has given us a master class in authentic faith community." As they prepared to leave, several congregation members approached to thank Matthew personally. Each interaction revealed how his simple questions had touched specific struggles or doubts they had been carrying. The elderly woman told him he had helped her feel young in her faith again. The scientist said he felt permission to integrate his work and worship for the first time in years. The teenager asked if she could friend him on social media, wanting ongoing encouragement for her daily faith challenges. Matthew looked confused by the social media reference, but offered to be her friend in real life instead, which delighted her even more than a digital connection would have. One man approached Jonathan privately. "I've been an atheist for 15 years, he admitted quietly. "I only came today because my wife has been begging me to try church again. Your nephew didn't convert me, but he made me curious about faith in a way I haven't been since childhood." Jonathan was moved by this confession, recognizing that Matthew's approach had achieved something that years of apologetics or evangelistic programs might not have accomplished. The child's natural inclusion and acceptance had created safe space for someone to reconsider previously abandoned beliefs without feeling pressured or judged. As they finally made their way toward the exit, Pastor Furtick walked with them, still processing the morning's events. "Jonathan, I hope you know that what happened here today wasn't just about Matthew's questions. Your humility in supporting his curiosity while stepping back from the spotlight showed everyone what authentic spiritual mentorship looks like." "He makes it easy," Jonathan replied, watching Matthew skip ahead toward the car. "He reminds me constantly that faith is supposed to be joyful and natural, not forced or performed. Playing Jesus has taught me a lot about spiritual truth, but Matthew lives it effortlessly." By Monday morning, clips of Matthew's church visit had spread across social media platforms. The hashtag #SimpleFaith was trending as people shared their own stories of spiritual questions and discoveries. News outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the 8-year-old who had facilitated profound theological discussions with such natural ease. At home, Matthew seemed unaware of the sensation he had caused. When asked about his church experience by his mother, he simply said, "It was good. People had lots of questions, just like I do." Uncle Jonathan was right. It is a special place where people think about important things together. Meanwhile, Pastor Furtick was fielding countless calls and messages from fellow pastors wanting to understand how to create similar environments for authentic spiritual exploration. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since Sunday afternoon, with requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and consultation on children's ministry approaches. "I've never seen anything like the response to yesterday's service," said Maria Santos, Elevation Church's communications director. "People are connecting with Matthew's approach to faith in ways that transcend denominational or even religious boundaries. Parents, educators, and spiritual leaders from around the world are asking how to foster this kind of open spiritual curiosity." Pastor Furtick reviewed some of the thousands of comments flooding their platforms. One particularly struck him. "Watching this child ask questions I've been afraid to voice for decades gave me courage to explore faith again. His innocence made me realize my complications were often just excuses to avoid spiritual growth." The church decided to launch a new program called Matthew's Questions, designed to create regular opportunities for people of all ages to explore faith with the same openness and curiosity the child had demonstrated. "This isn't about having all the answers," Pastor Furtick explained to his staff. "It's about creating community around the questions that matter most." What surprised everyone was the response from Jonathan's entertainment industry colleagues. Several high-profile actors and directors reached out, expressing interest in faith conversations that moved beyond Hollywood's typical surface-level spirituality. Matthew's authentic approach had somehow made spiritual curiosity socially acceptable in circles where faith was often viewed with skepticism. On Tuesday, Jonathan received an unexpected call from Dallas Jenkins, the creator of The Chosen. "I heard about what happened at Elevation Church," Dallas said. "Matthew's questions and your response to them embodied everything we hope the show accomplishes, making faith accessible, authentic, and inclusive. We're getting requests from families wanting to know how to have similar conversations with their children." Dallas continued, "Would you and Matthew consider being part of a special episode or behind-the-scenes feature about how the show impacts families?" Jonathan was honored by the invitation, but knew the decision ultimately belonged to his nephew. When Jonathan presented the opportunity to Matthew, the child's response was characteristically thoughtful. Would it help other kids feel okay about asking questions about God? When Jonathan confirmed that it might, Matthew nodded seriously. "Then I think we should do it. But can we make sure they know that you don't have to be on TV to talk about important things?" Throughout the week, Elevation Church received hundreds of emails from parents sharing their own children's spiritual questions and insights. Pastor Furtick realized that Matthew had inadvertently launched a movement of families taking their children's spiritual curiosity more seriously, recognizing them as genuine theological contributors rather than passive recipients of adult instruction. The following Sunday, Elevation Church was packed beyond capacity. Regular attendees mixed with newcomers drawn by the story of Matthew's visit, many bringing their own children in hopes of creating similar opportunities for spiritual exploration. Security was enhanced, but the atmosphere remained welcoming and family-friendly. Jonathan and Matthew returned as promised, though this time they arrived early and entered through the main doors rather than slipping in quietly. Matthew was excited to see familiar faces from the previous week, immediately recognizing several people who had asked him questions. His natural ability to remember and connect with individuals hadn't been diminished by the week's attention. Pastor Furtick had structured the service around the theme, Faith Like a Child. But he quickly realized that simply discussing childlike faith couldn't replicate the authentic experience of actually engaging with a spiritually curious child. The real power of the previous week had been Matthew's spontaneous questions, not planned programming around the concept. During the service, Matthew again raised his hand with a question, but this time his inquiry was different. Pastor Stephen, last week people asked me questions, but I have a question for them. If everyone learned something new about God, what are they going to do differently this week? His question demonstrated spiritual maturity beyond his years, moving from intellectual curiosity to practical application. The congregation fell silent as individuals contemplated how their Sunday insights would translate into weekday living. Matthew had unknowingly posed the challenge that separates genuine spiritual growth from mere emotional experience. Pastor Furtick recognized this as exactly the kind of accountability that authentic faith communities needed, but often avoided. A woman in the balcony spoke up first. Matthew, your questions last week helped me stop being angry at God about my husband's death. This week I volunteered at the grief support group because I wanted to help other people the way you helped me. Her testimony began a cascade of responses from throughout the congregation. The scientist from the previous week shared that he had started a weekly discussion group for professionals wanting to explore faith and science integration. The teenager reported that she had started a prayer group at her school for students facing social pressure about their beliefs. The man seeking forgiveness had begun volunteering with at-risk youth, using his past mistakes as teaching tools, rather than sources of shame. Jonathan watched with amazement as person after person shared concrete actions they had taken based on the previous week's conversations. His nephew had not only facilitated spiritual discussions, but had apparently inspired ongoing community engagement and personal transformation. The ripple effects of Matthew's simple questions were expanding far beyond anything they had anticipated. Matthew listened to each testimony with serious attention, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions that revealed his genuine interest in people's spiritual journeys. When a man shared about reconciling with an estranged brother, Matthew asked, "Was it scary to call him?" When the man admitted it was terrifying, Matthew responded, "But you did it anyway because God helped you be brave, right?" These follow-up interactions demonstrated that Matthew's spiritual gift wasn't just asking good questions, but creating space for people to explore the emotional and practical dimensions of faith application. He seemed naturally equipped to help others process both the excitement and the challenges of spiritual growth. As the service continued, Pastor Furtick realized that something unprecedented was happening. The traditional structure of worship, songs, sermon, prayer, dismissal, was evolving into something more organic and community-centered. Matthew's presence had catalyzed a more interactive and authentic form of spiritual gathering. Near the end of the service, an elderly man in the back raised his hand. "Matthew, I'm 92 years old and I've been a Christian for 70 years. But listening to your questions makes me feel like I'm just beginning to understand God. Is it okay to keep learning new things about faith, even when you're really old?" Matthew's face lit up with delight at this question. "I think God probably likes it when we keep being curious about him. Uncle Jonathan learns new things about Jesus every day for his job, and he's really old too." The congregation erupted in laughter at this innocent assessment of Jonathan's age, while the actor himself chuckled good-naturedly. "Besides," Matthew continued, "if God is really big and amazing, then there's probably always more to discover. Maybe being 92 just means you get to know even more cool things about God than younger people do." His response brought tears to the elderly man's eyes and affirmed the lifelong nature of spiritual growth. Pastor Furtick concluded the service with a challenge inspired by Matthew's example. This week, I want everyone to ask one question about faith that you've been afraid to voice. Not to me or to any pastor, but to God Himself. And then pay attention to how He might answer through your experiences, relationships, or continuing study. As people began to leave, the organic community building that had characterized the previous week resumed. Children who had attended with their parents were now actively participating in conversations with adults, their questions taken seriously, and their insights valued. Matthew had inadvertently demonstrated that effective spiritual community could be intergenerational rather than age-segregated. Several families approached Jonathan and Matthew, expressing gratitude for the permission they felt to take their children's spiritual questions seriously. One mother said, "My daughter asked me yesterday if God ever feels lonely, and instead of giving her a quick answer, I told her that was a beautiful question we should explore together." These interactions revealed that Matthew's impact extended far beyond his direct conversations. He had modeled an approach to spiritual curiosity that families were adopting in their own homes, creating ripple effects of authentic spiritual exploration throughout the community. As they prepared to leave, Matthew surprised everyone by asking Pastor Furtick a question that hadn't occurred to him the previous week. "Pastor Stephen, do you think Jesus would like our church? Like if He came here as a regular person, would He feel happy here?" The question was both innocent and profound, challenging the congregation to consider their community from Christ's perspective. Pastor Furtick took a moment to consider this deeply personal question about his church's culture and priorities. "Matthew, I hope he would. I think he'd love seeing people ask honest questions, support each other through difficult times, and leave here wanting to love their neighbors better. Those seem like things Jesus cared about." "Good," Matthew replied with satisfaction. "Uncle Jonathan says Jesus liked being around regular people who were trying to figure things out. I think he'd probably fit in here pretty well." This simple endorsement from an 8-year-old somehow carried more weight than many professional ministry evaluations. Over the following months, Matthew's questions became a regular feature at Elevation Church, with children and adults alike contributing to ongoing conversations about faith, life, and spiritual growth. The program attracted national attention as a model for authentic, intergenerational, spiritual community. Jonathan and Matthew continued attending when Jonathan's filming schedule allowed, but their presence was no longer necessary for the conversations to thrive. The child had successfully modeled an approach to spiritual curiosity that had become self-sustaining within the community, creating ongoing transformation long after the initial catalyst. A year later, when asked about the impact of that first unexpected visit, Matthew's response was characteristically simple. "I just wanted to know about God, and it turned out lots of other people did too." Sometimes when you ask questions out loud, you find out you're not the only one wondering about things. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone's simple question opened up profound conversations about life's biggest mysteries? Have you witnessed how a child's innocent curiosity can break through adult complications to reveal essential truths? Matthew and Jonathan Roumie's visit to Elevation Church reminds us that the most powerful spiritual insights often come not from those who claim to have all the answers, but from those who aren't afraid to ask the questions that matter most. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe that honest questions can be more powerful than perfect answers, and that sometimes the greatest teachers are those who approach faith with the wonder of a child.